what something looks like. And there's meaning that's available in the way it looks, so that your clients can go in, and it isn't that somebody told them these things, they can see it. It's right there in front of you.
Back to meaning.
Yay!
Back to meaning.
Chris? I found one of the interesting things on the Clyfford Still, I don't know how many other museums have done it, but it was almost approached like an interpretive, and true, a lot of it was about his life, so that you understood him better because it's dedicated to him. But the fact that they would put together the display, that was a timeline throughout his life. And you know, you could push whatever button you wanted to see what was happening socially, politically, worldwide, national, whatever, where he was living or whatever. I found that was fascinating because you could certainly make a connection between, well, all these forces that were going on in terms of events that had to be an influence to him mentally, psychologically, and sort of make a transference to, okay, well, this is what he knew, this was what was happening, and perhaps those events, those incidents were an influence on what you were seeing in terms of his art. It's automatic, correct? Meaning any artist is a reflection, like an architect reflects their time. An artist, I would assume, does the same. So I found that was interesting. I don't know how many other museums have ever attempted to do that, where they sort of link a kind of a timeline chronology to the span of time that artist was living and producing. I mean, I kind of like the panel to sort of respond to that, because do you really think that, in a sense, almost helps nurture not even trained artists or very intellectual people, but the general public who might be exposed to Clyfford Still, better understand maybe that what they're trying to do is nurture a kind of understanding of what was going on that may have then been relative to what you're seeing in terms of his output?
Anybody want to respond?
You know, Chris, I think what you're talking about makes a great deal of sense, whether it is in the Clyfford Still Museum or in the Museum of Science and Nature or wherever there's something like that. I think it's really fascinating to see what is going on and how it links to and relates to other things going on concurrently. So I think that's just a great thing, no matter where it happens.
Maybe in his case it didn't link. You know, maybe it's interesting for us, but it may not have been relevant for him. Because he really isolated himself away very intentionally. He set out to do that. He was very clear-minded about it. He deliberately removed himself from pretty much everything. And so maybe he wanted to shut out that influence, and we find it interesting in retrospect, and that's kind of it.
So I'm reminded of Hickey's statement about, you know, that artists, I make paintings and the world makes it art. So, you know, coming from that sort of perspective, it makes sense that the world, what was going on in the world, constructs the plays, the historic conditions under which things make sense to whoever it is. So, to my mind, those distinctions are so porous, and it's so, you know, the world is as much a definer of what I do in my mind as what I may at any moment decide to do. So it would be surprising if it didn't, I suppose.
This isn't where I wanted to begin, but I actually found that timeline sort of off-putting in a way, and I felt in some ways very manipulated by it. And the reason was that I felt that it was an attempt to locate Clyfford Still and his evolution in the context of world-shattering events. 1945, Auschwitz is liberated. 1963, the Beatles arrive in America. 1964, Clyfford Still produces such as, you know, and so I have to say I felt somewhat manipulated by it. And the other thing, in conversations I've had with people, inevitably, I didn't realize the Clyfford Still Museum would be such a reference point this evening, but in a way, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but inevitably the question of who is the audience for this arises, because essentially you're going to come and continue to see variations on the theme. You know, the work isn't going to be all that different. And one of the things that struck me when I went to it is that it was more useful for me to think of it not so much as a museum, but as a pilgrimage site. And nobody ever really talks about who the audience is for a pilgrimage site. The pilgrims come. And in a way, Bruce alluded to this when he talked about why the books, why the smock. You know, well, a pilgrimage site has to have relics. And I felt both the existence of these relics and of that timeline, I felt in some ways quite manipulated by. On the other hand, the question that interests me in terms of how people make abstract pictures and why there is a Clyfford Still Museum is that I don't think Still or artists of his generation shirked from consciously engaging themes that we think of with words like sublime, existential, profound, transcendent, whereas I don't know any living artist working today who wouldn't be embarrassed and shirk from those words. So the fact that the world has had a response to Still that in some ways parallels a religious one, a shrine-like place of pilgrimage, to me has to do with the fact that the scope of his concerns was in some ways cosmic, for lack of a better word. And it's interesting to me that as the means by which artists have to make pictures, both in terms of technically and in terms of vocabulary, has grown so enormously since Still's day, the scope of concern has somewhat become narrower and, for lack of a better word, more domestic. You know, so it no longer needs to inhabit the cosmos, it can inhabit the kitchen sink. You know, so anyway, those were just some thoughts that I had, and actually I'd like to hear from the participants on the scope of their concern in a way, like what are the themes that they engage in, how are they different, or how do they continue a lineage that one might trace back to Still in his generation.
I think that's an extremely interesting question and a really, really well-stated position. There are artists that still deal with spirituality and cosmic concerns, but they don't usually talk about it very often. But the question about how it relates to how we see things and that we're embarrassed by taking that big picture has maybe happened because of an academic reaction against it. And it's not something that can be talked about in a context like this without it sort of drawing swords. It's a very interesting subject. So, sort of the same with beauty. You know, that one can bring up a lot of arguments. So spirituality and beauty are kind of like cuss words in contemporary art. And how we approach them as artists has been internalized a lot in the last 20 years, 15 or 20 years. Did anybody know that? Does anybody know that? Mm-hmm.
I mean, for all my performance, you know, I am trying to, for myself, trying to understand how the nature of consciousness. I mean, that is a central thing around it. And I've looked at perception, I've looked at sensation, and, you know, I mean, I am involved in thinking about those large issues. I think part of it is, though, you know, history used to be the history of kings and the royals and the aristocracy, and nobody really paid attention to what were the serfs doing, what were the, you know, the common people doing. And now we have a history in the last, you know, several hundred years, what takes those things seriously. And I think in some sense it's, you know, yes, it's about the kitchen sink, except that, you know, I've certainly had profound experiences with a beat up skillet, visually speaking. that were sublime for me, but, you know, I'm always trying to make fun of that stuff, so. Blah, blah.
So your dangerously close to being asked on my next